Hollowbrook was not on any map. It had been forgotten by history, perhaps for decades, perhaps centuries. The roads leading to it were overgrown with thick vegetation, and the signs of caution were few and vague. Its existence seemed like an anomaly, a flaw in the fabric of the world. There was nothing special about the town itself except for the sky, and that was enough to mark it with an ancient, unfathomable presence. When Thomas Rook, a journalist from a distant city, arrived in Hollowbrook, he expected nothing more than a strange story, maybe an interesting urban legend, something to fill a page in his newspaper. What he found, however, was far more than he had bargained for. Something that could not be understood, something that once seen could never be forgotten. The sky. The sky above Hollowbrook was not like any sky from any other place. It was in a state of perpetual decay. During the day, a pale, distorted light cast long, sickly shadows that seemed to stretch on their own, as if the sun had lost its essence. It wasn't an ordinary eclipse, nor was it any natural phenomenon known to scientists. The sun was broken, consumed by something far beyond comprehension. What remained was a black orb in the sky, a void that cast an unnatural darkness, as though it were swallowing everything around it. But there was something more about this black sun, something the townspeople dared not speak of. Thomas, in his curiosity, spoke with several of the locals, but their words always faltered, as if there was an invisible barrier keeping them from speaking any further. They would mutter, with empty eyes and hollow faces, that the sun wasn't the real problem. The problem, they said, was what it represented. It was a door, a window into something beyond our reality, something that watched the world from its prison high above. The history of Hollowbrook started with the first settlers, people who came in search of fertile lands but quickly realized that what lay beneath the town was far more complicated than the geography around them. The first founders spoke in hushed voices of forgotten cults, beings of unspeakable forms that once ruled the earth, only to be banished to the sky itself. For these people, the stars and the sun were not just celestial bodies, but living entities, pulsing with infinite power. The black sun, the elders said, was placed there as a prison, a containment for the primordial being they had once worshipped, a being they called simply the Watcher. It wasn't a creature with a shape, or at least not one that could be comprehended. The Watcher was a consciousness of pure evil, a being of immeasurable power that had fed on stars and the souls of the ancients. The first settlers in their worship had tried to summon this being for power, but instead they were consumed by it. The Watcher, by nature, could never be sated, so its followers were imprisoned in the heavens, but the seal would never be eternal. The Watcher's hunger never ceased, and that was why the sun was black. Thomas had heard these stories before arriving, but he had believed them to be mere myths, fantastical explanations invented by those who still lived there. But soon he began to sense that something was terribly wrong. The feeling of discomfort crawled up his spine like a cold hand. He questioned the townspeople, asking directly about the strange figures he'd heard whispered about in the streets, the rumors of missing townsfolk, the vacant expressions as if the black sun had swallowed not just the light but the very souls of the people. And then things began to grow stranger. When night fell, or what should have been night, Thomas ventured out of his small hotel, determined to explore the center of town. He had heard whispers of an ancient stone circle hidden deep within the forest, where the cult had once performed their rituals in worship of the Watcher. Some of the oldest locals had spoken of it, but always hesitantly, as though they feared even remembering its location. Thomas followed the clues until he found the forest, a dense thicket of trees that seemed to intertwine like the fingers of a giant hand. The air grew heavy, cold, and the black sun's light, never fully dark, distorted everything, twisting the outlines of trees and creating a sensation that he was being watched. After what felt like hours of wandering, he found what he sought, the stone circle. It was ancient, worn by time and covered in moss, but still imposing as if something held it in place. When Thomas approached, he felt a presence, something much larger than himself. He touched one of the stones, and the sensation was like the earth itself pulsing beneath his fingers. The energy there was palpable, like an invisible magnetic field, brimming with ancient force. It was then that the sky above seemed to shift. The black sun began to move. It was such a small, imperceptible movement, but at the same time, it was so deep that Thomas felt his stomach turn. The stones began to glow with a faint light, and the shadows around him began to stretch unnaturally, pulling toward the center of the circle. The air vibrated, and the sounds of the world around him began to warp. Thomas looked up at the sky, and in that moment he saw something his mind could never comprehend. The Watcher was no longer imprisoned. It had been freed, and its hunger was infinite. From the blackness above came a sound, deep and guttural, like a distant whisper that filled his mind with incomprehensible horrors. His thoughts shattered as visions filled his mind, endless, maddening visions of a void so vast his mind could not grasp it. He saw an ancient city, long buried beneath the earth, inhabited by creatures that defied all laws of existence, beings with forms that twisted and melded into the blackness of the black sun. The Watcher had returned. In that instant, Thomas felt it, the Watcher's hunger. It filled him, wrapping around his soul, burrowing into his very essence. The whispers clawed at his mind, demanding to be fed, to consume him. As the shadows grew solid and cold around him, he realized too late that the sun was not just a celestial body, it was a prison, and the Watcher was never meant to escape. In a final, desperate attempt, Thomas tried to run, but his feet would not move. The shadows enveloped him, and he felt his very being drained away, as though his soul was being torn from his body. He saw his flesh distort, and the darkness began to take shape, forming into something that could not be described. As he finally lost consciousness, he knew this truth, that it was not only he who would suffer. None of us would escape the Watcher's gaze. None of us would survive its hunger. The next morning, Hollowbrook was no more. The stone circle had crumbled to dust, and the forest seemed to reclaim the land as though no one had ever lived there. In the far distance, on the horizon, the black sun hung silently in the sky, its hunger undiminished. And no one would ever speak of Hollowbrook again. If you've survived the terror, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join the Nightmare Vault family. There's more cosmic horror, eldritch beings, and nightmarish stories waiting just around the corner. Like, comment, and share your thoughts. What's the most terrifying thing you've encountered in the void? Keep your eyes open, and remember, the nightmare is always watching.